Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 37th Virtual History of 2021. My name is Kevin Johnson. I'm with the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. First of all, we'd like to thank everyone who donated to be with us today. Your support enables the BAF and Baltimore Heritage to organize virtual histories each week. A few announcements before we start. Next Friday, join us for a presentation with the Lily Carroll Baxton Museum about how the museum is engaging BCPS students about Baltimore's civil rights history, and mark your calendars for December 23rd for a presentation on Victorian Adams, the first African-American woman elected to the Baltimore City Council. Then we also have Say It Loud coming up. It's an ongoing presentation at the center. And then we have a date set up on the 18th if anyone would like to join. Now for today's presentation, Dennis, if you want to share your screen. Dr. Dennis A. Doster is a scholar of African American history with over 15 years of professional experience in the field of public history. Currently, he heads the MCPCB Black History Program, a unit of the Prince George's County Department of Parks and Recreation of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. In this position, Doster oversees 4 historic African American sites, undertakes and supervises research on local Black history, and produces exhibitions and programming for various audiences, including the county's annual Juneteenth Festival. Prior to joining the commission, he worked for the Alexandria Black History Museum and the National Archives. He's a 2018 recipient of the Prince George's County Social Innovation Fund's 40 Under 40 Award, and he is a 2019 recipient of the Pacesetter Award from the Association of African American Museums. Dr. Doster also serves as adjunct faculty in History and African American Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park and at the University of Maryland Global College. His areas of teaching and research expertise include the Civil Rights Movement, African American political and expressive culture, and Maryland African American history. If you have any questions during the presentation, please add them to the chat. With that, take it away, Dr. Doster.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you can hear me all right, and you can see my screen. So yeah, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to come today and present for you all on the Prince George's County Civil Rights Trail. As was mentioned in the introduction, I am head of the MCPCB Black History Program, which is the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And for this trail project, I have served as the lead historian for this project. I always like to begin any presentation, particularly presentations when I'm in the local community, with just giving a kind of a brief synopsis of what the MCPCB Black History Program is, just so people are aware, know that we exist, and if you have any questions or projects that you want us to work on, you'll know that we're here to become involved. And so we are an organization that was established in 1982. So this upcoming year, we're going to be celebrating our 40th anniversary. And we really came from the Prince George's County African American community pushing for something to be established that could tell the story of African Americans in the county, particularly in a time in the 80s when the Black population of the county was on the rise. By 1990, there was a Black majority in Prince George's County, which there still is today. And so the concern with in the community was that there were a lot of historic sites in our county, but they weren't telling the stories of African Americans. So, for example, the plantation sites that were being interpreted from the perspective of the great white master. And so now our program was created to add more to that narrative, and we've been doing that over the past 40 years, and we got to the place now where more and more of our historic sites are not only including African American narratives, but they're also kind of flipping how those narratives are told and expanding them even more. Just real briefly, some pictures that relate to the work that we do. So we do research, we do exhibitions, we do programming. You'll see in the bottom of the slide on the far left and far right, images from our annual Juneteenth festival, which we do, which is now in its 15th year. And then the remaining images on that slide are historic sites that we oversee. And so in my top left, Abraham Hall, which is a benevolent lodge built in 1889, the first historic African-American site in Prince George's County, fully restored with public funds in 1991. Dorsey Chapel, historic African-American church built in 1900. The Ridgely Rosenwald School, which was built in 1927 with funds from the Julius Rosenwald Fund. And then on the bottom in the center, you'll see the newest site that has been added to our portfolio. We've hired a manager to oversee this site, and the site is in the midst of renovation, and that's the Concord Manor Museum. And so this site, built in the 1790s, was built as the plantation home of a Revolutionary War veteran, Zachariah Berry. And so what we plan to do at this site is not tell the story from the perspective of Zachariah Berry, the white enslaver, but tell the perspective of the enslaved as well as the African-American community that sprung up on that property and around that property after the end of the Civil War and going into the early 1900s. So that's just briefly a little about what we do. And so this Prince George's County Civil Rights Trail project is right in line with what our office does. And so this is a project that we receive funding, the initial funding for this from the National Park Service through the Civil Rights Grant, African American Civil Rights Grant Program. And it is a partnership between our office and the Maryland Anacostia Trails Heritage, Maryland Milestones Heritage Area, in addition to the Prince George's County History Consortium. And so all of our entities kind of came together, applied for this funding, got additional funding, and have been working on this project to see it to fruition, even in the midst of the shutdowns of COVID-19. We've been working through that, and we are happy to be reaching the finish line, getting close to the finish line as we launch this project, which will include interpretive signage at sites that are part of this trail, as well as a website element that will accompany it as well. And on this site, the initial work and research and applications for this site included 10 historical sites, but we will be continuing, hopefully in the future, to expand upon that and add more and more sites as we do more research and bring in more narratives and stories, and hopefully add more markers at more places throughout Prince George's County. So that said, for today, I know my time is limited, and I'm going to try and keep watch of my clock to make sure I don't go over time. But I'm only going to focus on about, I think about 4 of the sites that we have identified, and talk a little bit about their history and how they fit into the civil rights narrative. And where I can also, because I am speaking before this particular audience, I hope to talk a little bit about connections to Baltimore as well. So the first site that I want to talk about, and so this is kind of, I'll be moving in this presentation chronologically, and so moving to the earliest era that we focus on, so the opening decades of the 1900s, we have the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis Trail, which goes over what used to be the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis Electric Railway, which of course went through all 3 of those cities in Maryland. And as you see here, a little map that just shows you where the trail is today, which is only a portion of that whole route that the electric railway covered. So you can see, if I point my cursor down here at the bottom with that black dot, that's this is the area that's in Prince George's County, and then you move from Prince George's County into Anne Arundel County. And so that is this trail that is remaining today, as I said, that was part of this electric railway. And so I think the next slide, so a couple of images here. And so just to give a little background on the WBNA Electric Railway, you see on on the left-hand side a postcard from 1912, which shows the three cities, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Annapolis, that this railway traveled between, and was, a very important development for allowing transportation between these different areas for, social reasons, for cultural reasons, for economic reasons. And so this particular railway opens in 1908 and extended was in operation until 1935. And so, and when we look at Prince George's County history, one of the things that's really important about the WBNA Electric Railway is that it opens up these lines of transportation that lead to development of some of the historic African American communities that are established in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So particularly communities like Lincoln, communities like Lakeland, and other communities that kind of border Washington, D.C. This railway is part of the infrastructure that enables African Americans to travel back and forth and to build kind of suburban retreat communities while they are working. A large number of them are working in Washington, D.C. So this Black middle class that begins to develop in the early 1900s. And so it's very important in that way. And then you see on the other side an image from the Baltimore Sun archives of the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis car, one of the cars from the electric railway. And so when we're talking about this particular site as a part of the civil rights movement, it's important in a number of different ways. So one, it's important because it speaks to one of the popular areas that we think about and talk about and read about when we talk about civil rights movement, which is public accommodations, and looking at ways in which individuals and organizations push back against segregation that occurs on public accommodations. And so we know, famously, one of the most famous individuals that we know about, or people will talk about when we talk about the civil rights movement, of course, is Rosa Parks. And we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and how that catapults Dr. Martin Luther King into prominence. And so when we're looking at this particular instance, one of the things that it kind of hammers home, and which historians have been doing for, I think, for at least the past couple of decades, trying to reshape what we think about and what we talk about as civil rights. And one of the things they're trying to reshape is our chronology, and realizing what happened in the 50s didn't just kind of burst on the scene out of nowhere, that this was the result of decades of organizing that was occurring in Black communities throughout the country. And so we see here African Americans who are pushing back, like I said, individually and through organizations, against segregation on public accommodations. And so we have instances that happen on the WBNA Electric Railway. And so this particular article that you see on the screen is from 1925. And in this particular case, you have two African American men who actually are suing in the Washington, D.C. court because of segregation that happened beginning in the Washington, D.C. portion of the WBNA portion of the line, as they were traveling from Washington, D.C. to Bowie in Prince George's County. And in addition to the headline that you see from 1925, on the opposite side of that, you see an image of a man, Charles Hamilton Houston. And so Charles Hamilton Houston is actually the lawyer who represents these two men in this case as they're suing for $30,000 against the WBNA railroad. And Houston is an important figure because for a long time he was kind of forgotten and not talked about. He died in the early 50s, I believe about 1950. But he was very important in the 20s, 30s, and 40s as someone who laid a lot of groundwork for the legal strategy that was being developed by the NAACP as the NAACP was going into the courts to fight against segregation on a multitude of fronts. And so Houston is a native of Washington, D.C. He serves in World War One. Because of what he sees in World War One, he comes back with this kind of renewed energy and this changed mindset of wanting to be involved in the law and wanting to use the law as a means to fight against injustices and inequality in society as it relates to African Americans. And so he becomes known as the man who killed Jim Crow. He eventually becomes the dean of the Howard University Law School. And in that position, he trains a whole generation of young Black lawyers who are trained in civil rights law and who go on in subsequent decades to take that knowledge and take that training into the courts to mount these legal challenges against segregation. And most famously, he trains Baltimore's very own son, Thurgood Marshall, who, of course, eventually becomes Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. And here you see two other images I decided to add just because. So in the trail for Prince George's County, we definitely are focusing on Prince George's County stories, but also with the WBNA, it's important to note that African Americans were fighting against segregation along the WBNA line throughout the state of Maryland. So there are instances where we see African Americans who are being subject to Jim Crow segregation in Baltimore and Annapolis, and they're fighting against it either individually or through organizations. And so this particular article comes from February 1919 from the Baltimore Afro-American. And you see here, it mentions that two men are suing the WBNA because of, once again, being forced to sit in segregated accommodations. And so one of the two men that is involved in this particular case is Carl J. Murphy, who not at this time, but eventually becomes the head of the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, inheriting it from his father, of course. So this will take us to the second site that I want to talk about. And so this gives you a map of where it's located. So the Cheltenham Reformatory, which goes by a few different names during the course of its history. And today there's the Cheltenham Youth Juvenile Facility that is in this area. So you see, here's where it's located, where the red dot is. And so this is a little bit south of Andrews Air Force Base and Clinton. And you'll see up here in the corner, National Harbor. So this kind of just orients you to where this is. And so this is southern Prince George's County. And this is a particularly interesting story that we're able to include in the trail because it doesn't just speak to the county specifically, it also speaks to the state. And so Cheltenham was established originally as the House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored Boys in 1870. And it ends up taking in young African-American men from all over the state of Maryland. And of course, that includes a large number that are coming from the city of Baltimore. And kind of from the very beginning, there are complaints that are being lodged by members of the African-American community about the state of things at Cheltenham. So they're complaining about unsanitary conditions, so rats being around, improper food or spoiled food that's being served. There's one article in the Baltimore Afro that just blasts the facility as a hellhole. There's complaints about abuse against the young men who are there, and that they're being used basically as slave labor. There are also complaints about African Americans not being allowed to be employed there. So for a long time, there are only white employees who are employed at the Reformatory, and the board that oversees the Reformatory is also all white. So we have, like I said, these individuals, and then most notably, the Baltimore NAACP becomes involved in launching kind of these investigations and complaints and petitioning the governor to do something at Cheltenham. And so eventually, initially, Cheltenham is privately owned. It becomes taken over by the state in 1937. So we begin to see some changes that happen after that. So in the 40s, the African Americans are become employed at that site, and you have an African American man who's hired as a superintendent there. But there's still the complaints about conditions that still linger on and continue to surface on a regular basis. So there then eventually is a push for African American representation on the board that oversees Cheltenham. And so here is an image of Cheltenham, one of the buildings at Cheltenham from the 1930s. And then here you see images of some of the African Americans who eventually are appointed to serve on the board of the Reformatory in response to this protest and agitation from the African American community, which, as I said, is led by the Baltimore NAACP. And so in 1948, Governor William Preston Lane appoints an all-Black board to oversee the Reformatory. Prior to that, there had been some Black appointments to integrate it, but then at this time, they completely reconstitute the board. It's all African Americans who are appointed. And so you see the governor is seated. You also see Willard Allen, who is president of the Southern Life Insurance Company. So he's seated right here. And then you have, I think right here, you have Violet White, who is the first Black policewoman in the city of Baltimore. And so they are part of this body of all African Americans as appointed. Then on this other side, you see, and these are two images featuring the same man. So this is him individually, and then here he is right here, if you can see my cursor. And so this is Dr. Robert McGuire. So Dr. Robert McGuire is well known as the founder of the McGuire Funeral Home, which is still in existence in Washington, D.C. Dr. McGuire did have a home at one point in Prince George's County. He did die in Prince George's County in the 1970s. But in 1951, he is appointed to serve on this body overseeing Cheltenham Reformatory. And he's then reappointed the next year by Governor Theodore McKelvin. And then this also is a story that comes out of the Cheltenham site. So there is a case in 1936 where 4 young African-American men are accused of raping a white employee at the site. And so the NAACP steps in, and this man, which hopefully we all recognize, Thurgood Marshall, steps in, and he takes charge of this case, and he ends up working and getting the charges dropped for these 4 young men who are accused of raping this white woman at the facility. And in the Baltimore African American, it's hailed as the Maryland Scottsboro case, linking this particular case to, of course, the case of the Scottsboro boys, which had occurred in Alabama just 5 years previous to this time period. And so fast forward, so we started in kind of the 19 teens and 20s. We jumped to the 1930s, and now we're here looking at the Bel Air at Bowie housing development, which is kind of in central Prince George's County. And so kind of right down here to the bottom, right out of view, is Route 50. So right north of Route 50, this is the area that we're looking at when we talk about the Bel Air development. And so Bel Air is a housing development that begins is being built in the late 50s by the well-known Levitt and Sons real estate company. They began building housing developments actually throughout Prince George's County. And so this becomes one of the more well-known housing developments. And just like we see in other areas of the country with Levitt and Sons, there are these restrictive covenants built in to the communities which bar African Americans from purchasing homes within the community. So here you see an image, and this is more modern day image. I think this is probably 1980s era, but this just shows you some of the homes uh, that are a part of this Bel Air community in Bowie. And then here you see actually two images from the Washington Star collection, which is at the DC Public Library, which show, the two sides of the protests that take place in the early 1960s. So in 1963 is really where you have the kind of hotbed of protest and activism, and so that's where these images come from. And so you see an interracial group on the left-hand side of whites and African Americans who are part of the Prince George's County chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality. And so they are involved in these protests, demanding that this community be integrated. And then on the other side, you see whites who are holding up these signs, "Keep them white." So they are very much on the other side of the debate in terms of wanting this community and similar communities to stay all white. And so eventually the core and other organizations do succeed in integrating the Bel Air development in Bowie. And I don't have, I guess I'm short on time, so I won't show it, but I did have a clip that I'll just speak about. And so there's a clip of a documentary that was just done, I think maybe within the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, which aired on Maryland Public Television, which talks about the whole entire history of the Bel Air development in Bowie. So it's called Tales of Bel Air at Bowie, and so it actually is still available on the Maryland Public Television PBS website. And so if you go, you can still access that documentary. I think it's about 50 minutes long, and it'll be available. I think it expires in 2023, so it'll still be up for a while. If you want to get a little bit more deeper history of the whole of the development, and it also includes stories about this civil rights protest and activism that occurs at this site. And then also, and I think this is the last site that I want to talk about with the time that I have. And so also what we have on as a part of our trail is the Coalfield House, or what they call now the Coal Student Activities Building, on the campus of the University of Maryland. So in more northern Prince George's County. And so there's the building right there, just adjacent to the mall, McKeldin Mall at the University of Maryland. And so Coalfield House was built in 1955, and it's primarily known for being the arena where the previously the Maryland Terrapins basketball team used to play prior to the building of the new center on campus. But in 1966, the campus was host to the Final Four for the NCAA basketball tournament. So in that championship game, you have a first. So you have the team from Texas Western competing against the team from the University of Kentucky. So it's the Texas Western Miners and the Kentucky Wildcats who are competing against one another. And this is significant because Texas Western has a first for having a starting team that is all African American, and they're all African American competing against an all-white University of Kentucky team. And not only did they compete against them, but they actually end up winning the championship. And so you see here On my right, the Texas Western, two images of the Texas Western team. And then on the left, they make it onto the cover of Sports Illustrated. And for those who know basketball, this gentleman right here, the Kentucky uniform is Pat Riley. And so in this particular narrative, we're able to show a national story related to Prince George's County and how this particular game becomes important in paving the way for subsequent integration that occurs in sports on the collegiate level. And so this becomes an important symbol. It also proves to the kind of naysayers and the staunch segregationists that this is something that's possible and that this is something that's positive and can be a good thing. And so that opens up the doors of integration in the sport in the years following this championship. I think, I don't have another picture after that. I did have one video, but I think I might be a little short on time, so I'm not going to show that either. But there also one of the more recent developments that has occurred at the Coalfield House is that just this past year, with the new president that has been appointed at University of Maryland, they have named the athletic center that is now housed within the football training center, an athletic center that's now housed within Coalfield House, has been named the Jones Hill House in honor of the African American players who integrated the sports of football and basketball on the campus of the University of Maryland. And so that's another way in which this particular site is speaking to the history of civil rights, not just in the county, but kind of a broader history of the civil rights movement. So that, I think I'm going to stop here because I don't want to go too far over my time, but I will close out with just a few other kind of closing thoughts. And so I think these particular sites that I selected are emblematic of the entire trail and the other sites that we talk about. And I think the important thing about the Prince George's County Civil Rights Trail, the lessons that it teaches us are, one, it challenges the classical narratives of the civil rights movement that say the 50s and the 60s are the only time period in which this activism is happening. And so we see how that's not the case, and it's a much longer chronology that's taking place. It's also showing ties that are not just about the county itself, but it's also beyond local, it's regional, so there's connections to Baltimore and Washington, D.C., which is very important and unique for the county, that it sits kind of in between these two major metropolitan areas that at least during these earlier decades had very large Black populations. And so because of where it was located, Prince George's County was able to tap into these very well-established Black communities that had large numbers of social, cultural, and civic organizations. So actually, if you look at the history of the NAACP, I think if you look at the top 5 local chapters of the NAACP that were established in the country, Baltimore and Washington, D.C. are in those top 5. And so at a time particularly if you look at the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the Black population of Prince George's County was in the minority. And so they were able to tap into the cities of DC and the cities of Baltimore to bring in the resources and bring in those leaders to help out with those the struggles that are going on as it relates to civil rights activism. So I think that's another important story that we can tell by looking at Prince George's County Civil Rights Trail. And I must also add that I think, as I said at the beginning, that this is something that we hope to continue to work on and add more sites and more stories. There are other sites and stories that we already kind of have found that we didn't know about, a year or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. And so as we go on, we'll hopefully add more and more of those stories as we broaden out this narrative. So I'll stop there, and I'll open it up to, I guess, turn it over to you all if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That was wonderful. I am a lifelong Marylander and I learned a ton today. So thank you. Before I forget, could you put the link to the website in the chat so that people can access it?
So the website is not live yet.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But I put my email address up there just in case anybody has any questions, or if you want to be added to our email list, and I'll make sure that that Megan gets this information too, and that we can make sure that you're kept abreast of all of the developments in terms of when the website goes live, and also when we have hopefully unveiling ceremonies for the signage that we'll be putting in the ground.
So that was actually going to be my next question. Are there plans to have signs at all of these different places, like markers of some sort?
Yes, that is the plan. As I said, we were moving along with the project, and then COVID-19 hit, so that's put a little bit of a wrench in the plans. But we're moving further along with that, and we do hope to have some sort of groundbreaking or some sort of unveiling ceremony with it. Some of the signs or one of the signs when we get to that portion.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I'm just going to keep asking questions because I wrote down a ton. But if anybody else has one, jump in, add it to the chat. So the Cheltenham Reformatory story was so poignant and sad and important. And I was just wondering, are there historic buildings left at that site, or is it one of those things where they've raised everything and put up a new building that's more utilitarian?
No, I think there is. I think there might be one building still at the site, and then there is a graveyard that's associated with that site. And there are graves of young men that were at that reformatory there. So there is a historic, some small historic elements still left at the site.
Wow.
But as you said, there is the modern building. And I think that I'm glad you brought that up, that also this kind of speaks to the chronology of the movement not being just we want to go back in time, but also that we want to go forward in time, because within the past couple of decades there still have been complaints against the juvenile detention center at Cheltenham. So that has been something that has been ongoing as people are complaining about the conditions that are there and the treatment of the people who are there.
Very good point. Any other questions there? I also had a question about Concord Manor that you mentioned at the beginning. Do you know when that's going to open to the public, and also where is it sort of close to?
Two very good questions. So when is it going to open? So this has been a long project with starts and stops, and so we are working with the state, with the Maryland Historical Trust, and so we sometimes the timelines are out of our control, and making sure that everything is done and restored according to guidelines of the state. So that said, we're hoping within the next year that we are be able to open the site, but at the least we'll be doing programming outdoors at the site, even if the indoors is not quite complete yet. And so where is it located? So it's located within Walker Mill Regional Park, which is in District Heights, and that's exit 13 off of 495.
Has any archaeology been done there, or are there plans to do anything?
So that's one of the plans that's in the works. That there's no archaeology actually has been done yet, but they want to do some archaeological, like you said, surveys, so that we can see what we find and how that can feed into the interpretation that occurs at the site.
Absolutely. I feel like Dennis and I are just having a conversation. We're just chatting back and forth. So, so I think that's. This is a little off the civil rights, but still very important. You talked about the plantations in PG County. Do you know roughly how many there are that are historic sites, and how many are interpreting their work differently in the past couple of years?
So the ones that are historic sites that are open as museums, the majority of them are a part of my organization, the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And so, and I always get the number wrong, but there is the Riversdale House Museum, there's the Marietta House Museum, there's the Montpelier Mansion, there's the Surratt House Tavern, which is not necessarily a plantation, but there is a history of slavery at that site. And there's Darnell's Chance House Museum down in Upper Marlboro. So I think I named them all that are actually open as historic sites. And then in addition to that, I know there's outside of our organization, there's the Bel Air Mansion in Bowie, which actually related to the Civil Rights Trail, that was used as the office for the Levitt & Sons Company as they were building the Bel Air community in Bowie. But yeah, so those and all of those sites that are part of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission are definitely doing a lot of work right now in terms of, like I said, looking at the interpretation in a different way, putting the stories of African Americans, of Native Americans at the forefront, and not focusing on the great white man that was at the house. So
awesome. I know there are sites in Baltimore trying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
We got a question here. Beyond the work of the NAACP, Black newspapers, and CORE, were the federal government or other organizations, white or Black, important in advancing civil rights in the area?
Let me read. I see the question.
Yeah, can you see it? Okay.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of at least the stories that we're interpreting. And most of it is through local organizations. And so I would add, in addition to the NAACP and CORE, one of the sites that we talk about is Bowie State University. That's part of the trail. And so looking at the student organizations on the campus that are important in student government, they're another example of a type of organization. Then, of course, the Black church is very key in a lot of these stories in some way or another. I guess a governmental organization that plays some kind of role in one of the sites that we talked that is on the trail is the Thomas Callaway House. And so Thomas Callaway did a lot of different things. So, but one of the things he did was he served on the Maryland Interracial Commission. And so that was something that was established in the late 20s, I believe, by the governor of Maryland. But of course, it wasn't something that the governor established on his own. It was established because of pressure from local organizations and civil rights organizations like the NAACP pushing the governor to do that. And so that was a body consisting of white and Black leaders in the state who were studying what the problems were and then making recommendations for ways in which the state government could respond to those issues. And met, and I would say probably met with little success and was a relatively short-lived organization.
Okay, well, we're at 1:45. I want to thank you again, Dr. Dennis Doster, for coming out and talking to us, and we look forward to seeing how this project progresses.
No, thank you all for having me, and always great to be able to share the work that we're doing and to talk about history, and we look forward to sharing more with you as it comes online.
Wonderful, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.